After the Civil War, America wasn't just rebuilding cities. It was trying to rebuild its very soul. And in a really short, totally explosive period, 3 constitutional amendments were passed that were so profound, they're often called the nation's second founding. So let's dig into how these incredible promises of freedom were made, how they were broken, and then how they were ultimately reborn.
Okay, so picture this. It's 1865. The guns are finally silent. The Union, it's been preserved, but the nation is absolutely shattered. I mean, just think about it. In Georgia alone, over 40,000 people were dead or wounded. Cities were in ruins. And on top of all that, you have 4 million people who were once enslaved, now free. But this new reality, it brought up a massive, monumental question.
So, what did freedom actually mean? Was it just not being someone else's property? Or did it mean something more? The right to vote, to own your own land, to actually be seen as an equal citizen under the law? This one question. This was the question that would define the next decade.
And the huge, messy, complicated battle to answer that question, well, that all went down during an era we now call Reconstruction. It was this massive attempt to, reconstruct the South, and really to reconstruct the very idea of what America was supposed to be.
And wow, what a turbulent time it was. Just look at this timeline. It shows you how incredibly fast everything was moving. Think about it. In just 5 years, from 65 to 70, the country ratified 3 of the most important amendments in its entire history. That's insane. But then, just as quickly, it was over. By 1877, Reconstruction comes to a halt. So let's break down what these big promises were actually all about.
All right, first up, the promise of freedom. This was the big one, the most fundamental promise of all. It was about getting rid of the very thing that started the war in the first place, slavery.
So here's the language of the 13th Amendment. And it sounds powerful, right? It sounds direct and absolute. It didn't just end slavery, it also gave Congress the power to enforce this new freedom. So on the surface, this looks like a total win for human liberty. But take a closer look at those words. There's a catch.
And here's where we see that gap between the promise and the reality. On one side, you've got this incredible promise of freedom. On the other, the grim reality. And it all hinges on one tiny little phrase, except as a punishment for a crime. That little clause, it turned into a massive loophole. See, Southern states immediately started passing laws called black codes. These laws made things like being unemployed a crime, and they were aimed squarely at newly freed black people. This led to a ton of convictions, which then forced black Americans right back into, you guessed it, involuntary servitude. This time as prison labor. It was a system that would have consequences for generations.
Okay, so slavery is officially abolished. But that just leads to the next, even more radical question. Who actually gets to be a full American citizen? And this is where we get the next big promise.
Now, the 14th Amendment, this thing was a revolution on paper. Seriously, first off, it gives us birthright citizenship. Simple idea. If you're born here, you're a citizen, period. Then it drops these 2 huge concepts on us, due process and equal protection of the laws. And this is the really crucial part. For the first time, the Constitution was being used to tell the states what they couldn't do. The whole idea was to create this federal shield, something to protect every American from being discriminated against by their own state government. But almost as soon as that shield went up, it started to get shattered. The Supreme Court of all institutions began to just dismantle it, piece by piece. First, you get the civil rights cases in 1883. The court basically said, yeah, this amendment only stops the government from discriminating, not private businesses like hotels or theaters. And then came the big one, Plessy versus Ferguson. This is the case that just invented this whole twisted idea of separate but equal. And with that ruling, the Supreme Court basically gave a constitutional green light to segregation. It just gutted the whole promise of equal protection for almost 100 years.
All right, so freedom, citizenship. What's next? The final piece of the puzzle, and maybe the most fundamental right in any democracy, the right to vote.
And that brings us to the 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870. And just like the 13th, it seems so clear, so straightforward. It says right there, you can't deny someone the right to vote because of their race, their color, or because they used to be enslaved. The whole point was to make sure black men could be part of the political process.
But, and you can probably see where this is going, again, that promise was completely subverted. That road to the ballot box, it was basically turned into an obstacle course. See, the amendment didn't say you couldn't have other qualifications to vote, so states got creative.
They came up with things like poll taxes you had to pay, literacy tests that were impossible to pass, and these ridiculous grandfather clauses. All of it was designed for one purpose: to stop black people from voting. And when all those legal tricks weren't enough, there was just straight-up violence and intimidation to keep people away from the polls. So for millions of people, that promise of the ballot was just snatched away.
So you have to ask, right? Were these amendments just a complete failure? I mean, for a long, long time, it sure looked that way. Once Reconstruction officially ended in 1877, the whole era of Jim Crow segregation just took over. But here's the thing. That is not the end of the story. The legacy of these amendments, it was really just getting started.
This really shows you the long, painful road from that initial promise to some kind of fulfillment. These amendments from the 1860s, they basically lay dormant for decades, but they never actually died, so let's walk through it. Fast forward to 1954. That's almost 90 years later, and the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause is suddenly brought back to life in Brown versus Board of Education, the case that finally struck down segregation in schools. Then, just about a decade after that, the 15th Amendment becomes the legal foundation for the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and that's what finally gave the federal government the real power it needed to enforce the right to vote for everyone.
So here's the big takeaway, right? The Reconstruction Amendments weren't really a promise denied, they were a promise delayed. It's like they planted these seeds back in the 1860s, and even though it took forever, those seeds finally grew into the legal bedrock for the entire civil rights movement of the 20th century. And honestly, they are still at the very center of some of our biggest legal debates today.
And that really brings us to our final thought. You know, these promises of freedom, of citizenship, of equal protection, they were made more than 150 years ago. And when you look at the world around us today, you just have to wonder, is the work of that second founding, the work of Reconstruction, is it finally complete?